Okay. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I can see quite a lot of people coming here through the waiting room. So apologies for having kept you in the waiting room a little bit longer than you might have expected. I'm Lynette Russell, and this is the inaugural Global Encounters Annual Symposium. I'm speaking to you today on the unceded lands of Naarm, the home of the Kulin Nations. Has been the home of the Kulin Nations since time immemorial for thousands of generations, father to son, mother to daughter, and on. It's never been ceded. It's completely remains in the care and the custodianship of contemporary Kulin Nations people. We acknowledge and honour elders, both past and present, and we give thanks for all the support that we are given to our endeavours through the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre and through the Indigenous community support that we have. I was really hoping that today we would have been able to be welcomed to country, given acknowledgement of country from our Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous, Professor Jacinta Elston, who's been a fantastic supporter of our work and remains one of our real champions. But unfortunately, getting a spot in her diary was basically impossible. And I think it's a good example of just how very busy a lot of senior Indigenous people are as they attempt to negotiate the dual worlds of the academy and the community. So this is such a thrill. We've been planning this for a long time. We did hope that we might have done this in person. Some of us are here in the room. There's a small group of us in the room, but many of us, unfortunately, are still stuck on Zoom. We are recording this, so if anybody has any reasons that they don't want their questions recorded, please do let us know that before we make the recording public. So our first session today is, I'm very excited to say, when we were putting together our wish list, we came up with all sorts of names of people that we thought were on our dream team, the list of people we would hope. And Keith Camacho was right at the top. And I have to say, I was really so surprised, thrilled and honoured when he answered with an affirmative yes that he'd be happy to give a talk in our symposium. So I'm absolutely delighted that Keith Camacho from University of California, Los Angeles is going to be talking to us today. His co-presenter is Kyle T. Mays, who's currently in, from what Keith just said, he's currently in Georgia, but we've not quite got him yet. So what we might do is we might just go straight to Keith. And Keith is going to speak. Now, if you've got questions, comments, we really want this to be a dialogue. It's very much the idea of the whole symposium. So if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. We can highlight you later on and you can ask them in person if you'd prefer, or we can read them out. But over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Lynette. Kyle should be logging on any second. I just got a note from him, but I want to thank everyone, Professor Lynette Russell and Senior Research Officer David Hallworth. And I'm speaking from Tavongar, also known as the City of Angels, Los Angeles. Tavongar is what the Indigenous Tongva call this place. And my colleague Kyle is a professor at UCLA as well. He's in African American Studies and American Indian Studies. I'm in Asian American Studies, but I do Pacific issues. And here's my colleague Kyle. And so Kyle, jump in when you have a chance. And just one quick housekeeping thing. Anytime, any questions, comments you have, please put them in the chat. For example, I'm going to I do have a question here, a few questions that me and Kyle put together. But in the meantime, I'll hand the mic over to Kyle, and then the format, we have 6 open-ended questions that we'll address through our 2 works. Kyle just published his second book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. We can chat also about his first monograph and his third and forthcoming book on Detroit. And then I'll be discussing my anthology called Reppin', Pacific Islander Youth and Native Justice. But I'll hand the mic to Kyle. Kyle, you can go from there, and then I'll go after Kyle, and we'll save up. We're looking at 30 minutes Q&A with everybody. So Kyle, you got the mic.
Hey, what's up? My apologies, y'all. I just had some technological issues real quick, but I'm going to share my screen real quick and just talk very briefly about my approach to Blackness and indigeneity within the Americas, specifically within the US. And as you know, sometimes technology isn't always working the way it should. All right. Y'all can see that? Cool. Can I get a thumbs up? Cool, cool. All right, so this is, again, is just an approach to Blackness and indigeneity, specifically Afro-Indigenous history within the US context. So in addition to the questions that Keith and I have come up with, in a general sense, the questions that how I approach my work and how I think about this are really two things. What is the relationship between people of African descent and indigenous peoples? And how have they forged alliances to think beyond the US democratic project? Now, some folks find that a radical proposition. I don't. I think it is important to think beyond a US democratic project rooted often in whiteness and white maleness in particular. And the other question that I did not put up here that I often think about is, what will these relationships look like in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? And I don't think the US empire is a good thing for Black and Native peoples and other oppressed groups. And so if we go with that proposition, I think that's a fair question to ask. And I think Keith and I sort of share a similar approach to our work. And real quickly, so this is just an imperfect chart to look at how often Black and Native peoples are positioned, whether in Black studies or Native studies or in understanding US history. So of course, folks will say these two groups are so different, they have very little in common. So dispossession for Indigenous folks, enslavement, and thinking here of someone like the late anthropologist Patrick Wolf, for example, in his Traces of History book, where he very clearly says Black people are exploited for labor, Indigenous peoples in the US are exploited for land. Ignoring, of course, the whole idea that those were Indigenous folks who were kidnapped and forced to come to the Americas. I won't get into that, but that is, I think, something that's ignored, or that settler colonialism also exists on the African continent, which I will get into today. How they're treated in the US as domestic dependent nations, which is a legal characteristic that continues to shape the lives of Indigenous peoples. The second-class citizen treatment of African Americans in the US. And what is the nation state's goal? To, of course, assimilate and disappear Indigenous people. So never able to do so. But if you think about contemporary popular culture, literature, and how in the US people talk about Native peoples as people of the past, the issue of mascots, which remains an ongoing issue, it's very ever present, or the lack of education within the US system about US students. So what did you learn about Native peoples in grade school or high school or secondary school? And often it's very little. And African Americans segregate, exploit. The treaty relationship, and then some people say the difference between Black people and Native peoples, and it is a difference in political terms, but not, I don't think, necessarily in the goals of certain groups, right? So Native people have a treaty relationship or just want to be left alone, and people of African descent are fighting for civil rights, although that ignores a lot of Black radicals who, again, are thinking beyond the US democratic project. And of course, their global setting around global Indigenous rights and African Americans may be human rights. And again, this is imperfect, but it's just a way to how often people segregate or really analyze the differences between Black and Indigenous peoples. So one of the first scholars in the US is Carter G. Woodson, who is often called the father of Black history. Wrote this article in 1920. One of the longest unwritten chapters of the United States is that treating of the relations of the Negroes and Indians. And he was talking about the Northeastern tribal nations within the US and their intermingling with people of African descent. And those tribes still experience a lot of anti-Blackness amongst even Native communities, certainly within the US context. And two of my favorite scholars, but especially Taya Miles, they wrote this essay in 2015. Pain and loss, slavery and land, these terms map onto and move through one another and are perhaps the primary concepts in Afro-Native studies. And the point they make here, I think, is crucial. Without a fertile land base and free labor to work it, the US would not have become the prosperous empire that it became. So even important projects like the 1619 project and its original iteration just ignored settler colonialism as a political analytic. And it's this whole narrative that slavery and the subsequent anti-Blackness, which is fundamental to the US, but of course they're, again, exploited on dispossessed Indigenous land, which can be very much ignored. And common things I hear when giving talks as an Afro-Indigenous person working amongst two different communities often, my Black folks will say the Indians enslaved us too. And I'm like, well, that was like 5 tribal nations. It wasn't every Indigenous nation, but it's a common thought amongst African Americans, which I try to dispel in some of my own work. And Taya Miles brilliantly explains, for instance, the Cherokee Nation did so because they wanted to demonstrate their level of civilization to stop the further encroachment of the young United States encroaching on their land. And then after the Civil War, when a faction of the elite of the Cherokee Nation sided with the Confederacy, they opposed Black liberation because slavery by that time was just a way of life for them, right? And so it became codified in their customs, beliefs, practices, etc. And I think it's something that the Cherokee Nation, but the rest of the nations, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, have yet to really deal with systematically, even as sovereign nations. How do you deal with the anti-Blackness that's rooted in slavery in your particular nations? And I think they still have a lot to do there. So Samuel Roxy Intellectual Vine Deloria Jr., probably one of the most important Native intellectuals, had a lot of things to say about how different Black and Native peoples were. And he says here, for many people, particularly those Indian people who had supported a self-determination a decade earlier, Stokely Carmichael, who had changed his name to Kwame Ture, was the first Black who said anything significant. And I call this a lens of Deloria. That is, I think there are still a host of US Indigenous folks who view the differences between, say, Black radicals and Indigenous radicals as being so different. And they utilize this idea of from Deloria that Black people are fighting for civil rights, when in fact, Carmichael was one of the few African Americans during the 1960s and 1970s who was adamant that this is Indigenous people's land, right? He's one of the few that I can recall. And the Black Panther Party, perhaps being another one, that was like, this is not Black people's land, this is Native people's land, right? And there are other groups like the Republic of New Africa, founded in 1968, who wanted the 5 southern states as their own, which causes a historical issue, which I don't think they ever really resolved, a tension about if you get reparations, how does that work? And does the conversation around reparations include the return of Indigenous people's land? I'm gonna wrap up just with a few Black power and red power. I kind of see them similar around calls for land and relationships and rethinking or challenging US democracy in particular ways through particular Black radicals and Indigenous radicals. And also show these pictures. This is Angela Davis with Orange Lions, and she was supposed to go to Wounded Knee, but it was a Black blockade there in the FBI. A lot of Black another one here, this is Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and Russell Means and Dennis Banks. And this is the speech, one of the speeches where Ture adamantly said this is Native people's land. And I think that's important to recognize during that time period. And finally, I'll end here. This is Angela Davis with Clyde Belcourt and the National Alliance Against Repression. Again, once and again, showing solidarity. And I think going forward is an important thing to consider, not only right now, but in the question I asked earlier. How can we recover histories, but also think about going forward, again, in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? And I'll pass the mic over to Keith. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyle. So I just want to, me and Kyle will be going back and forth, and we welcome everybody's questions and comments, and I really appreciate Lynette and everyone bringing us together to talk about indigeneity and Blackness, local, global, in between. And so my questions, Kyle addressed his through the PowerPoint. The three I want to share with you to open up. What is the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity in Oceania? Second, how have Pacific Islanders reproduced or contributed to settler colonialism? And what are the prospects of Black and Pacific Islander solidarity in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? And so let me begin. So on the first question, what's the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity in Oceania? Historically, the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity in Oceania concerns the manner by which Europeans, Japanese, and Americans variously constructed and imposed their respective racial categories and hierarchies about indigenous peoples. This history is deep, far-reaching, and problematic. As early as 1832, the French explorer Dumont d'Urville carved the Pacific into 3 provinces. There's actually 4, Malaysia, but we can talk about that later. 3, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. In d'Urville's view, Melanesia represented a region of Black people, hence his usage of the Greek terms mela, as in Black, and nesia, quote unquote, as in islands. Today, many indigenous people from Melanesia, here I'm thinking of Vanuatu, Fiji, Solomons, Papua New Guinea, identify as Black, but not exclusively along racial lines. Instead, they often understand themselves as indigenous peoples, as many of us in this room know, as indigenous peoples with cultures and languages akin to other islanders throughout the region. In other words, we can easily turn to one of the many colonial archives in the English, French, German, Japanese, and/or Spanish languages to examine how and why these colonial powers represented and treated indigenous peoples of Oceania as Black, or as non-human beings, second-class citizens, and/or stateless subjects. We can likewise take stock of European slavery and indentured labor in Oceania, the outcome of which led to the making of plantation in Queensland, Australia, British Fiji, and even US-occupied Hawaii. Imperial Japan also took a cue from the West, often mimicking such racial categories, but in ways that elevated the Japanese as superior to the so-called Black and savage people of the Pacific region, especially Micronesian islands like the Marshalls, a topic recently theorized by the scholar Greg Dvorak of Waseda University. Although Kyle's new monograph, and I want to congratulate Kyle, folks, he's a great colleague, great scholar, and he's really pushing my thinking. So thank you, Kyle, for being here. Although Kyle's new monograph and an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States does not engage the historical relationship between Blackness and indigeneity in Oceania, or even Australia, his work can and should inform how we reckon with both Blackness and anti-Blackness across the Native Pacific, the European Pacific, and the Asian Pacific. Indeed, as Natasha Sharma of Northwestern University and Robbie Shillem of Johns Hopkins University have previously noted, the Black Pacific also exists. And it is time that we in the academy and in everyday society unpack the challenges and opportunities presented by our critical relationships with Black peoples the world over, and with the many ideas that align and do not align them with the Black Atlantic's history of slavery. Specifically, I applaud Kyle for advancing two provocative positions in his book. First, that African Americans in the United States and diasporic Africans more broadly should identify as indigenous peoples. Let me say that again. First, that African Americans in the United States and diasporic Africans more broadly should identify as indigenous peoples. Second, that African Americans and Native Americans and Blacks and indigenous peoples more generally should engage and link their and our struggles for freedom, however construed. So Kyle provided some nice PowerPoint images and kind of visual treatment of what freedom might look like or does look like, rights, treaties, reparation, etc. Right? Now, with regard to identifying Africans as indigenous peoples, Kyle had this to say, quote, "It might seem controversial to call Africans and their descendants indigenous peoples, but it is not. To reclaim insofar as we can imagine the indigenous roots of Africans in the diaspora is neither an attempt to replace indigenous peoples of the United States, nor to act as settlers in some real or imagined return to Africa, as previous generations have done. However, we do have to account for the fact that besides some cultural remnants that were able to survive historical erasure, Africans living in the United States because of enslavement were stripped of their heritage," end quote. How might this statement be read in the indigenous spaces across Oceania, across Aboriginal Australia, across this region? One potential response would involve the increased humanization of indigenous Africans, indigenous African Americans, and indigenous diasporic Africans, especially since many Pacific Islanders identify with other indigenous people by way of the arts, popular culture, and sport. The Maori of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori, Native American, and Native Hawaiian, also First Nations, cultural triangulation of the past 2 decades is a case in point, as is the Festival of the Pacific Arts and Culture, the premier gathering of indigenous artists that occurs every 4 years. And Taiwan has been a big player in how we think of indigeneity, and Lynette and all the folks here who do Aboriginal Australian studies in really stretching indigenous and stretching and pushing the political limits and the interventions therein. I can easily anticipate the welcoming of indigenous Africans, indigenous African Americans, indigenous diasporic Africans who call Oceania their home to these kinds of spaces. In fact, the contributors in my anthology, and this is my shameless plug for this volume I just edited, a lot of Pacific Islander youth from Vanuatu to Aotearoa engage Blackness, right? In all these critical, but also uncritical ways, right? And so these are at the same time, and here, you know, I have some of this kind of love and optimism, but at the same time, there's these really serious challenges, right? And we could also witness a rise in anti-Black racisms among Pacific Islanders and many others, especially since anti-Blackness, we're learning anti-Black ideologies in the church, in the military, and in society. And COVID-19 is really opening that up in the worst way. We can talk about that in Q&A as well. Perhaps Islander youth can be that generation to move beyond the anti-Black racisms of their elders. After all, Kyle reminds us that African Americans and Native Americans have historically supported each other, red power, Black power, land acknowledgement, land reparation, all is materially supported as much as they have disavowed each other by way of slavery, colonialism, and policing. Ultimately, Kyle says, quote, Black and Indigenous survival after centuries of violence has been about creating a future. creating a future. Survival has never been passive. It has been a sustained creation of possibility for living in a white supremacist world. Caring for one another is the only way we can actually imagine and then envision the society that we actually want to live in. This will not be easy, end quote. And so my second question here, how have Pacific Islanders reproduced or contributed to settler colonialism? When me and Kyle are going back and forth with some working questions, honestly, sometimes for me, the question is more like, how have Islanders not contributed or reproduced settler colonialism? How have Islanders not extended empire writ large, right? In my view, Pacific Islander cultural systems, and I'm speaking from Oceania, that's my expertise, Pacific Islander cultural systems dominate more or less the American and French colonial Pacific. This form of domination now extends into the colonial spheres of militarization and law enforcement in many places in the region. In Hawaii, one of the largest US settler colonies, Native Hawaiians represent the main demographic, not minority, the main demographic in the police force, and Native Hawaiians also constitute the biggest male population, the biggest adult male population. And in Guam, in Micronesia, many Chamorros, indigenous Chamorro women, men, and transgender individuals valorize the mythic Uncle Sam, quote unquote, the white personification of the United States. We call him Uncle Sam, right? As these folks proudly wage US wars globally. In doing so, many Chamorros implicitly identify as anti-Black, even anti-Native. And I can talk about this in our Q&A, right? Clearly, nevertheless, settler colonialism is a structure enabled by the settler communities of France and the United States, Australia and New Zealand. But in Oceania, we cannot separate these structures of power. Indigenous people are alive, they are active, all right, as are the regional geopolitics of China, Taiwan, Philippines, South Korea, and Japan, countries that co-determine our existence. While analyses of these historical and contemporary manifestations of settler colonialism prove useful, we should also consider the ways by which Pacific Islander youth push back against colonial and indigenous-led iterations of settler colonialism, militarism, policing. And so in one of these chapters, Demaliza Saramosing, who's a Visayan scholar, wrote a really, really nice chapter about Truquis and Filipino youth, Truquis being an indigenous community from Micronesia, and Filipino youth working in Kalihi, one of the most economically, politically disenfranchised cities in Hawaii, and how these youth are really materially engaging Native Hawaiian understandings of place, creating safer streets for bicyclists, pedestrians, and just really creating new languages around the kind of freedoms that Kyle's pushing us to think about and realizing those freedoms, right? And so finally, what are the prospects of Black and Pacific Islander solidarity in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? To further open up a conversation and dialogue, and we still have a lot of time, we really want to hear from everybody. I want to address this question with a quote by Joyce Pualani Warren, an African-American and Native Hawaiian professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Joyce's dad is African-American from Watts in Los Angeles, and her mom is Native Hawaiian, Kanaka Maoli from Oahu. Pua, as she prefers to be called, is writing her monograph entitled Theorizing Po, Blackness and Bodies in Pacific Islands Literature. For Pua and many Polynesians like her, Po variously means darkness, a chaotic yet generative space from which life emerges. Po is also the realm of the gods. It can order time, and it can be both helpful and harmful. So like Albert Wendt, the Samoan novelist, writes about Po. Patricia Grates writes about Po in the Maori kind of world. And so Po is this generative darkness. It's a generative blackness. It's an expansive blackness. And so in a forthcoming forum about her book and scholarship, Po elaborates upon her understandings of Po as relational. Po as relational. And this is where I think Kyle's really pushing my thinking. I thank you, Kyle, as relational. And this is what Po had to say. Quote, increase understandings of Blackness as relational will help Kanaka Maori or Native Hawaiians be in better relation with our many cousins whose Blackness is not Afro-diasporic, but indigenous to Oceania, Fijians, Papuans, Kanaks, Australian Aborigines, and many others, end quote. As per Kyle's vital interventions, we can also add to Pua's theorizations of the Po, the indigenous Africans, indigenous African Americans, and indigenous diasporic Africans, thereby forging many worlds and many futures where the darkness of the Po generates life for Blacks and Natives alike, inward, outward, always. Seduas Masi, and thank you. So we're opening it up for Q&A. I mean, you know, Kyle, anybody, Lynette, anyone?
Thank you so much. Now, I'm assuming people can hear me again. Yes, thank you for the thumbs up. Excellent. Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you. And it's really important to be reminded that global encounters, when people are encountering, it's not just the newcomers and the, you know, and the people who are there. You know, it's so much more complex than that often. I particularly thank you so much for a mention of the brilliant work of Patrick Wolf, much missed by us here in Australia, I can assure you. A couple of things that sprung to mind as you were both speaking, and we do have a couple of questions, but I'm just going to take the chair's privilege and make a couple of quick points. The first one is the fantastic work, and this is actually, thank you to Leonie for this, the fantastic work of John Maynard, who is an Aboriginal historian here in Australia, who's done an enormous amount of work on the relationship between Australian Aboriginal activism and the Marcus Garvey movements. So that's something I don't know if you're familiar with, but I would love to draw your attention to. I love that quote, survival has never been passive. If that's just a very, very powerful statement. I wanted to ask a question, Keith, of you. Many, many years ago, I had before I became a historian, I actually studied archaeology. And we went to the Marianas Islands and we did excavations there with Chamorro people. And I was really taken by the disconnect that they had between the heritage that we were very privileged to be able to work on and their own sort of heritage. They didn't see it as theirs, even though they were indeed Indigenous people. And they were much more likely to tell me about their Spanish ancestors. And it struck me as something I'd never encountered before, certainly not in Australia, that they had a curious interest in their heritage and their history, but it didn't have a sort of sense of proprietorial nature to it at all. I'm wondering if that's something you've encountered as well with working on Chamorro.
That's the identification of whiteness, you know, and this is the Chamorro indigenous identification of whiteness, historical. The one sentence version, for those who don't know much about Micronesia, the Mariana Islands, or Chamorros, the one sentence versions, you have Spain colonizing this region for several hundred years, right? And so Chamorro indigenous identifications with Spain and that kind of form of power has been heavily racialized through the church and through government, right? And so that's for further research, Lynette, because my sense of it is that there's so much indigenous and indigenous Black and indigenous, what we call mixed race today, encounters in that period. But you know, when you're colonial interlocutor, when you're outside the gates of the empire, you want to identify with the whites. You want to do these kinds of things and these gestures. So I can see why they might make that kind of gesture where, you know, with you coming in, even, you know, I mean, just for outsiders generally. But for me, what I think is really much needed is to kind of go back to those archives, go back to those oral histories and really unpack, you know, what was not so much a Spanish empire, but an indigenous circulation of goods and ideas and trade and bodies and all those things in the Marianas. And so, but yeah, you see this transition, you know, into kind of like US whiteness and now militarism, but Spanish whiteness and Spanish empire, came before that. Which island were you at, by the way? Which island?
Rota.
Oh, okay. It's a lot of spirits in that island. I'll tell you that right now. I don't want to go there by myself. I tell you that right. If I go, that's a whole other thing. There's a lot of some heavy spirits in that one island.
Yeah, it was a remarkable experience. It's one of those ones that will remain with me forever.
That's great.
We've got a question from Campbell McKnight, and I'll read it out, but I think this is a really important one to sort of stimulate some discussion. So others, please chip in if you want to. Campbell says that in looking for the sources of labour to develop an economy, does anyone in the American context deal with the contribution of British convicts before 1776? After all, that's the labour source which got Australia started, obviously, in 1788. I'd love to know the answer to that to myself.
Yes. I don't think it's like if I was to think about what's taught to, say, grade school to secondary, I don't think it's couched in that particular way. But certainly by the time you get to university, it's more so cast as far, sometimes, depending on the professor teaching it, I think, it's cast as British convicts. Mm-hmm. And the labor, but it's still the issue of slavery that dominates the discourse and what's taught. So they're either indentured servants, and then they have these issues, and then it becomes a history of Black and white in a particular way. Yeah. That is a history of race, and less so about labor, depending on the historian and the context of the course, if that's the question someone was really trying to get at.
Yeah, that is an interesting one, because certainly the work of Cassandra Pybus looked at Black convicts in Australia. There were significant numbers of people who might be described as Black or coloured who were transported along with others, the British and the Scottish and the Irish as well. So, yeah, fascinating stuff. I've got a comment here from San, I don't know if I have to pronounce your name, sorry, Sandha Jithu, and it says Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U, is a South African affirmation of dignity and relational respect. Sadhna, thank you so much, Sadhna, and apologies. And thank you very much for that, Ubuntu. It's a nice term. I think I'd like to try and use it. Harry has said, have you encountered Indigenous Black interactions in the maritime industries, such as whaling industries, for example? I certainly have, Harry, as you know, but I don't know if other people have as well. Maritime industries, again, that's an interesting one, because to go back again to the work of John Maynard makes the argument that Australian Aboriginal activists learned about Black power activism through the maritime industries. It was through working on the wharves and working on the ships that was really how these two things came together. Does anyone have a comment?
I think on the maritime, if I can just comment on the maritime industries, I feel like this is, it is a topic that's explored tangentially in the US context. And you see that especially with kind of like historians, so you see like, I know David Chang has written about Native Hawaiians recently in global context, maritime context being one of them. I think Dave Igler, who's at UC Irvine's, written similarly. And so there is increasing efforts, and Matt Matsuda again, I hate, just being US centric here for a second, is trying to push forward is what he's calling Pacific worlds, but precisely to decolonize how we think of these areas of study, US maritime, English maritime, Australian maritime, bringing British South colonial India with British Fiji, those things. So, I think we have a lot of catching up to do in California, where I'm based, and some of the folks and really bridging these kinds of gaps for us as well, but it's been a while since I've been engaging maritime, particularly maritime history, geography. I know David Chappelle and a bunch of other folks have written about that and those things. But Kyle, do you feel that sensibility opening up on the East Coast or other places around kind of like, maritime history?
Yeah, so it's mostly like 17th, 18th century, a little bit of the 19th, and less so, say, during the era of Black Power and Red Power, certainly. Paul Cuffey being a particular person, at least not in Oceania in particular, but on the Atlantic coast, and being one of those early Afro-Indigenous peoples, and someone who tried to create a sort of Afro-Indigenous, I don't really want to call it a settler colony, but that's basically what it was. Trying to civilize the natives, even though that's who his mother was from the early America context, and his father was kidnapped from present day Ghana and enslaved. But that's really it. Nothing really 20th century.
Alistair L. Patterson over in University of Western Australia, and it must be very early for you in the morning, so thanks for tuning in, Al, has noted that they found African-American crew on board a US vessel off the Western Australian coast in the 1840s. They've actually inscribed their names into some rock art, and the reference is there for anybody that might want it in the chat there. My colleague Leonie Stevens has a question, and I'm just going to slide across and make this slip seamless.
Hi, we're doing this because there's terrible reverberation in the room. Look, it's just, thank you, Keith and Kyle, both of you, for great papers. It's with regard to the second question that you put in the chat, how have Pacific Islanders reproduced or contributed to settler colonialism? I was thinking about the role of religion and Christianization, because that, settler colonialism and Christianization always went hand in hand, and thinking about across the Pacific, the way especially the Methodist societies would sort of go in and they would convert people, say in Tonga, and then they would bring Tongan missionaries to Fiji, and then Fijian missionaries would go to like the Bismarck Archipelago, to New Britain and New Ireland as agents of Christianization, but also of colonialism. I just wondered if you wanted to tease out a little bit about that sort of really, sort of very powerful, the word that sprang to mind was poisonous then, but that nexus between Christianization and settler colonialism too. Yeah. Thanks.
Wow, this is like me going to confession booth, at a 2 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, and I just had my communion, and the priest refused to give me the host, refused to give me Jesus, but that's a great question. And I feel like there's excellent work coming down the pipeline. Latu Latai, who's Samoan, who's a pastor and worked with Margaret Jolly at Australian National University, has published several articles on this subject, Leonie. And so, really taking stock of in his case, how Samoans reproduce an extended, what you might call the liberating and oppressive forms of Christianity, liberating because for some Samoans, it provided resource, power, mobility, but oppressive because, it was part of this missionization project and proselytization project that allowed for the establishment of towns and cities and settler colonies and codified, penal codes and all this. There's a range of things, but I feel there's so much more work to be done in that regard around kind of like how Pacific Islanders extended the Christian colonial project throughout the region, and so we find a lot of Samoans and Tongans doing that even now today with the Latter-day Saints Church, right? And but there are also really it's funny you mentioned that P.K. Thompson, he's finishing his PhD at Claremont schools in California, and I saw him the other day at a funeral of all places in LA, and he goes, Keith, you have a minute? Yo, what's up? And he goes, I want to write a radical liberation theology of the Pacific. You know, what does a radical liberation theology of Oceania look like? So that's this kind of framing question. And we have a lot of really important work coming out of, you know, the indigenous Americas, especially Central South America, you know, a lot of testimonials and memoirs, you know, Rigobert Menchú and all these folks, really great work. But we don't really have a counterpoint, you know, that's indigenous led in that way, a counterpoint around that kind of like imbrication between indigenous spirituality and the colonial churches, the colonial religions. We don't really have that kind of counterpoint. So I really, you know, the work is still upcoming. There's people like Latu, like I mentioned, PK Thompson, they're, you know, really trying to really push how we understand these things. And not just in Papua New Guinea, but also in Australia and other places. There's so much more work to be done. And I think like Kyle, this is why Lynette, when Lynette invited me, I thought of Kyle right away, because I think Lynette, Kyle, a lot of us are really trying to really push the fields in these ways. This is not a history of 1970. This is not anthropology of 1980. We are in a new place, and I really credit the younger scholars out there really stepping up and doing really good stuff. I mean, I read Kyle's book. This is my third shameless plug. I read his book, and it's like, it was a page turner for me. It was like helping me decolonize all those things I learned in graduate school around Blackness and anti-Blackness. And so I feel like, going back to the religion question, there is much more work to be done.
Thank you. Kyle, there was something that you were saying in your comments around, for example, and it's the thing that I have been told all the time too, the Cherokee owned slaves. I'd never thought of it through that framework that you talked about, that lens that says, well, this is a relationship of power and being disempowered in a sense. I wondered if you could unpack that just a little bit more, because I'm assuming that not everybody in the audience would necessarily be familiar with this.
Yeah, so from like the 1760s onwards, one of the first documented treaties that the Cherokee Nation signed with colonists, British colonists that is, and so forth. And then when the US becomes a nation and they're trying to expand, of course, you have settlers who are wanting to go further, what is now the southern United States, so Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina. And it's a British colony in particular ways. So what the Cherokee Nation says is like, okay, since you all want to expand slavery, and it's a lot of financial interest. So historian Claudio Sount has a fantastic book about the things that led to Cherokee removal in the 1820s and 30s. So you have modern insurance industry, financiers, and so slavery and dispossession is happening at the same time. And within the US context, we often talk about one without talking about the other. And so the Cherokee Nation is like, well, if we want to show that we're civilized, let's engage in the practice of enslavement. The practice of slavery was not new to them per se. What was new to them was a practice of straight up all forms of slavery and captivity are brutal, but I think there are certainly levels to that when you make it hereditary in a particular way, such as chattel slavery in the US and even other forms of enslavement today. And so they're like, we're going to show we're civilized. And when the US keeps trying to renegotiate treaties, get more land, they'll say, we'll have our own forms of reading. But the basis of their civilization was the enslavement of people of African descent, which it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that, but they had already practiced forms of enslaving other native peoples beforehand. And so in some ways, it's an easier thing to get into because they're already outsiders. And I'll end here that one of the other myths is, well, native slavery was less brutal than US white American slavery. No, it was just as brutal often. and difficult. Although some Africans became interpreters during negotiations, so that you can find historical moments of, I suppose, fluidity, but in general, it was a brutal practice to be asked, look at some of the oral history, some of the Workers' Progress Administration, that they had issues with the Cherokee slave owners as well.
Thank you. Actually, it reminds me a little bit of the Maori. Oh, sorry, someone's just made the same comment here. But the Maori, certainly in Aotearoa, Maori were known to keep, in a sense, keep slaves, or keep. Often they were white men as pets. And there was one that particularly fascinated with red hair. Andonis just put his hand up and is going to ask a question. I'd be delighted to have you ask that question, Andonis.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Lynette. Hi, Keith. Thanks, Carl. Must apologize, Carl. I missed the very start of your paper, so forgive me if you kind of discuss this. But I'm very interested. I mean, I'm a migration scholar, but here I'm interested in thinking here about how notions of mobility and movement intersect here, and how we can think about problematizing migrant and settler in the same frame. And so I guess I'm interested in how both dispossession and slavery are also part of the dynamics of mobility, both forced and free, if you will. And so can you speak to that and the intersection there with Blackness and indigeneity? But thank you both, and it's good to see you, Keith, again.
Yeah, likewise. We met in Melbourne, I think, a few years ago.
Yeah, and then subsequently in Sydney. Anyway, yeah, good to see you both.
I'll answer real briefly, and then I'd be curious also to know Keith's thoughts on this. So, at least for me, and partly, I admit, because I think the personal is useful in some contexts, as an Afro-Indigenous person, and if white supremacy and the US empire crumbled like tomorrow, which I wouldn't be too mad at, but that's a different topic. Then I'm like, all right, so what do we do with people of African descent who and their descendants were forced to come here? What do we do with people forced to come from El Salvador or Central America because of the United States' neoliberal policies, or other people forced to come here, right, for particular reasons? I personally, I don't call them settlers, and there are some folks within Indigenous studies, I think, who often apply that term, and I think they do it because some folks can, but I will say some Indigenous folks can also, as Keith mentioned, can also engage in supporting this practice of settler colonialism or capitalism. That's a whole other discussion too. I don't call them that because if you're forced to come here, and maybe you don't know the history, but hopefully you learn some form of solidarity. But they're taught from a white supremacist perspective, folks forced to come here even now to the US or wherever, that this is a land of opportunity, and this is just a settler colonial myth and idea. But they're not often taught, just from personal friends' experiences, et cetera. They're not often taught about the brutal history within this country. And so they can easily adopt it. And then it can be some source of tension when they first learn something. But if you're fleeing a brutal civil war, I'm going to excuse you for not knowing the intricacies of US history, power, and domination, at least for me. I get why some Indigenous folks would be upset about that. But and finally, I think it would be up to the different nations. What are your protocols for adopting newcomers? And if you don't remember those, make some new ones. I'm not someone who is so wedded to tradition, whatever that means. Often that's homophobic and sexist. Those ideas of tradition, I think, often can be used as a form of oppression. Like, what are protocols? And if you need to create new protocols, use some more. Like, there's room for people forced to come here. And I think we need to do a better job as Indigenous nations, et cetera, of formalizing those things. I'm sorry, Keith, I wanted to like give you an alley-oop right there.
Oh, okay, my bad. I'm still trying to catch the ball on the court, Kyle. I'm not strong like you and the group here. So just to piggyback on Adonis' great question. Question just to recap for the group is, what's the difference or the parallel between migrant and settler or newcomer? What are these kind of like junctures and ruptures, right? I think on the one level, these are very esoteric terms. These are things we talk about as academics, right? And so I feel like politically and theoretically, they do have their import, right? In all registers, in Native studies, in settler studies, in history, in anthropology. And I think, we also have these various indigenous traditions, as Kyle mentioned, and so it's an ongoing rub, it's an ongoing tension that's very site specific, right? But these terms do help us think about things. And so I'll give you one concrete example. Evan Lay Espiritu Gandhi, who's a colleague in my department, has this book coming out on Vietnamese refugees in Israel, Palestine, and the US colony of Guam, right? 5, 10, 80 years ago, no one's going to put Israel, Palestine, and Guam and Vietnam in the same theoretical frame, right? No one. Give me an example. I can't think of anybody. But this is where the kind of import of these categories, the utility of these categories, where she's using these, what she's calling refugee settlerism, right? Taking stock of the kind of the imperial veil of Israeli humanitarianism, right? To use Vietnamese refugees as a foil to say to the world, look, we're welcoming migrants, refugees, we're helping them while they dispossess Palestinians. United States, look, we're processing Southeast Asian refugees in Guam. We're processing there, putting them in churches. We're humanitarian, while they militarize the hell out of Guam and Asia Pacific, and Australia's in that mix, right? So the categories have these political critical import. I think for indigenous communities generally, the challenge that Kyle mentioned is tribal specific, indigenous specific, nation specific. They're all gonna have their own beef, right? They're all gonna have their own kind of like motives. And what I appreciate about Kyle's book is that he unpacks these different historical moments where Blacks and Natives fight and conflict and are hating on each other, right? And for resources, whatever, homophobia, but he's also underscoring moments where they work together, where there's efforts and, whether migrant, settler, slave, really unpacking those things on their terms, seeing freedom and struggle is not passive, but constant. And I feel like, again, it's a site-specific question. It's Native specific, but as opportunities to open up discussions, right? Like Evan and Kyle, really opening up, like what you're doing, Adonis, opening up these discussions, in ways, I for selfish reasons, like Lynette, I wish I was back in grad school. Man, all those things I learned in grad school, man, I'm like, where was I, So no, great question, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Ollie,
I just wanted to
go on, please.
I just want to add one quick thing. And also, I think, frankly, there's some indigenous nations and individuals who adopt this whole notion of American exceptionalism and are therefore become anti-Black and very anti-immigrant or xenophobic in some ways. And it's something I don't think we talk enough about, even within many of our own communities. Yeah.
Thank you. Ollie here in the room with us has just made the comment that this ideas of forced mobility is very relevant to his family, who were forced out of Chile after and onto Australia, obviously leading to a very complex relationship to the Australian settler colonialism. And I would also add my own family, my white ancestors arrived in Australia as convicts. That's how they got here, I'm afraid. My great-great-grandfather was done for stealing a leg of lamb on a Sunday afternoon. And he was sentenced first sentenced to death and then commuted to life exposure, life in Australia. I noticed Ron Adams had a comment here which relates back to that comment about religion, and it's a really useful one. The early Samoan and Rarotongans sent out by the LMS, the London Missionary Society, to Vanuatu and Kanaki in the mid-19th century, also provided a model of missionisation not led by European missionaries, but by other Indigenous people, and which accounts in part for the later emergence of a liberation theology and theological perspectives in Vanuatu and Kanaki. So it might be an interesting place to look for your, was it Evan's idea about a liberation theology? I think it's a wonderful idea. If we don't have any other questions, I have another one that I'd just like to tease out, if we may. And I'm thinking of an article from quite some years back now that Nicholas Thomas wrote about Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, and just looking at the kind of racial groups, the supposed racial groups, and basically blowing it out of the water and just showing what a nonsense it all was. I wondered, Keith, if you wanted to just tease apart a little bit more about that layering of definitions around groups of people in the Pacific.
Yeah, no, those things are, these categories, right? Melanesia, Black Pacific, Micronesia, small island Pacific, Polynesia, many island Pacific, right? It's so fraught, all of them, I don't even really like to say Polynesian or Melanesian, Micronesian in some ways, because it's just there's so much colonial baggage. In Micronesia, right? The United States and the United Nations codified Micronesia, right? Created this kind of like saltwater lake, a geopolitical lake with Yap and Chuk, right? As a kind of buffer, political military buffer from perceived threats in communist Russia, so-called terrorist Indonesia, etc. This is still the case, right? And then Polynesia, there's also such a thing as Polynesian intellectual hegemony in the academy and all these things, and at the disavowal of Melanesians and other islanders. So this is just a lot of, I think it's more like not what these things are named, but what you do with them, and so I feel like, but I don't know, Kyle, what do you think, Kyle, whether Melanesia, Micronesia, or how do you think like folks in the region from Aboriginal Australia to Oceania, that provocative point around Indigenous Africans? I've been sitting with that for the past week, right? Again, like Lynette, it's not just the naming, what you do with the naming, right? What you do with the naming, right? And so this is not trying to get off the hook in terms of Lynette's question about these Melanesian, Nick Thomas, great essay, great work on these categorizations, right? And how they're reified. Right. And so I wanted to ask Kyle to kind of like open up for more Q&A. Is like, Kyle, like, what have you, when putting that out, Indigenous Africans, that frame, how do you folks think would respond in the US settler context in Africa and other Indigenous spaces? Because Kyle, is it, I'm forgetting, Kelly Lido Hernandez just came out of a book called City of Inmates, where she talks about the rise of the prison and the caging, in LA, the prison system, policing. But she brings indigeneity and settler colonialism into that narrative. And according to Kyle, Kelly might have shared this with you, and this is for the group, she's been giving talks, and I asked her again about naming, right? So she's naming now settler colonialism, and Kyle's naming Indigenous Africans. I asked Kelly straight up, how have Black radical intellectuals responded to your, positing of like, to talk about Blackness, you have to talk about indigeneity and settler colonialism. And she says she's beginning a lot of pushback. This is Kelly. So I want to ask Kyle about naming, right? Framing. What's your sense, in putting that out, and how do you think people are going to respond in Black studies and Native studies, you know, because this, you know, your book just came out, you know, it's really great stuff. But I want to kind of like, in the sake of naming and framing, what's Kyle's thoughts on that?
Well, I know some of my indigenous studies folks are going to be upset because when they hear indigenous Africans, or when I say understanding indigeneity as a part of the African diasporic process, and I mean, they think I mean, oh, so these are people who are coming here to take our lands. And I'm like, and displace us. And no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, how do we talk about belonging, right? So often when I hear indigeneity, I think people mean only land. That's my understanding within indigenous studies, like not only, but predominantly. And to me, land is fundamental, but what about people who are displaced, right? So if someone is displaced, an indigenous population from Central America, do they all of a sudden lose their indigenous roots and sense of self, culture, cosmologies, ways of being, knowing, etc.? Did the Africans kidnapped through the brutal transatlantic slave trade lose, you know, their cultures, identities, languages? No, we just assign this label of Blackness, right? And what I appreciate about Keith's edited anthology was the connections in discussing contemporary forms of Black culture with Pacific indigenous youth, right? And also bring in the urban context. Because for me, something like what we would call in the US, African American Vernacular English or Black English, Ebonics as it was called back in the day, is a form of African American indigenous cultural production practice, right? An indigenous cultural production that has circulated because of hip hop and other forms of expressive culture throughout the world. And so I've heard like really cool hip hop in Japanese, German, all sorts of languages, but they're still adopting what Frantz Fanon would say you're adopting. When you adopt a language of someone, you're adopting the culture, and you're also embodying those thoughts and ideas of those peoples, right? And so when I think of indigenous Africans, I think of it in terms of culture in a particular way, and also thinking a lot of Stuart Hall and Black cultural studies and how that culture circulates and becomes predominant for a lot of young people around the world, but they're still adopting forms of Blackness in a particular way. Sometimes problematic, it's sometimes very useful in a particular way. And so I'm trying to push people to think indigeneity, not simply in terms of land, when you account for the historical issue of displacement, forced migration, etc.
Thank you so much. We are drawing very close to time. This has been absolutely astonishing. I'm reminded of a moment that a couple of years back we were doing the Australian Bureau of Statistics does a census, and a young man came to the front door and was collecting the census. And we got to talking, and it turned out that he had Navajo heritage, and he was telling me he was born in Australia, he'd lived in Australia all his life, but his family had built on some property up in the mountains somewhere, a ceremonial ground where they would practice their Navajo traditions. And I always thought that was a beautiful example, a little bit like what you're saying, Kyle, you know, make new traditions, do new stuff if that's what it takes. And I think that's really empowering and wonderful, truly wonderful.